Digital Humanities, which is, of course, the breakfast of champions. So, sort of brief statement about this paper. The core portion of this paper is actually getting published in conference proceedings from a conference that I wasn't even at, which is sort of extra special. But it's good that it's getting picked up through conference proceedings, because it would almost certainly never make it through peer review. But this is essentially a paper, and I talk about this in the opening portion, about a sort of performance art piece that has been done at WVACET a couple of times. And unfortunately, Dr. Sandy Baldwin, who's in charge of this and sort of invented this performance piece, is no longer there, so it's gone potentially to RIT. The title of the paper is Dead Clov Speaks, or Beckett Pwns News, Challenging the War on Terror Ideological Fantasy through the Beckett Spam's Counter-Strike Project. It's spring 2015, and I'm sitting in 123 Pleasant Street, a Morgantown bar. The laptop in front of me is hooked to a projector on a stage. I switched back and forth a couple of times between the video game Counter-Strike Global Offensive and a condensed script of Samuel Beckett's play Endgame. The computer doesn't process the switch as quickly as I'd like, but because I'm playing ham and have more long speeches than anyone else, I can't type fast enough to get all the text into the dialog box. So I have to switch back and forth, copy-paste into longer speeches. I check the microphone in front of me and sip an IPA. I feel more confident reading the dialogue aloud than I am typing it. Beckett's bizarre and contradictory phrasing feels faster and more natural for me to speak. The lights dim and Dr. Sandy Baldwin, the director and innovator behind our performance art piece, tells the few audience members what to expect. The Beckett Spam's Counter-Strike project was in its second incarnation when I performed as Ham. Sandy had created the project a few years earlier using WVU grad students as actors, almost exclusively English grad students. Essentially, his idea was that we would perform a condensed version of a Beckett play in both the physical space of the nightclub and the digital space of the game. The performance itself involved 4 cast members typing the dialogue into the text boxes of our CSGO avatars and verbally speaking the words for those who had come to watch us live, which was about 6 people. Myself and the 3 other actors were situated in different parts of the nightclub with projectors on both sides of us and on the stage. Sandy's idea was to create an immersive performance space that spectators could walk through, looking over our shoulders and at the screens, and essentially experiencing the performance and the game from all sides. In our rehearsals for this half-digital, half-live performance piece, we had extensive discussions about what we were doing and why we were doing it. What did we want our audiences, both digital and live, to get from the project? How could we convey those intentions? What did we think was important about performing Beckett in a video game, in Counter-Strike in particular? This paper is an attempt to think through some of the implications of the Beckett Spam's Counter-Strike project. And specifically, I suggest that our guerrilla theater production intervened to highlight ways in which the game space and the war on terror mentality it represents are already absurd. In his 2001 State of the Union address, U.S. President George W. Bush launched what has become known as the war on terror, as we all, I'm sure, remember. This war has fundamentally reshaped mindsets and worldviews across the globe, creating, on the one hand, a climate of fear, Islamophobia, and xenophobia in the U.S. and allies like Britain. And on the other hand, Arabs and Muslims, or sometimes Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and even occasionally Latinos mistaken for Arabs, have found themselves on the wrong side of a clash of civilizations, ostensibly pitting defenders of freedom, justice, and liberty against barbarians using violence and terror to try and impose their own distorted brand of Islamic fundamentalism on the world. In his speech, Bush divided the world between the camp of the good and the camp of the evil. As he put it, every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. And I really thought about doing my impression of Jon Stewart's impression of George W. Bush, but I decided to spare you all. Despite fears, anxieties, and uncertainties created by the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, George Bush made the world simple again. The choice was either or. Either good and freedom or evil and terror. And much of the Bush-Cheney era war on terror was run on this premise, which leads us to the video game Counter-Strike Global Offensive. For those of you not familiar with this game, Counter-Strike is a first-person shooter pitting teams of counter-terrorists against teams of terrorists, generally in either a hostage rescue mission or a bomb-defusing mission, in any number of scenarios from a Middle Eastern bazaar to Parisian streets to a Haitian dock. Part of the appeal of this game is that it plays out the ideological fantasy of the war on terror, specifically that the conflict can be separated from ideology, motives, and causes and reduced simply to a clash between opposing forces. Each scenario features groups of counter-terrorists fighting groups of terrorists, and the objective is always determined by the mission type, again, either bomb scenario or hostage rescue. Other than changes in scenery and uniforms, there are no substantive differences between Chechens bombing a defunct nuclear silo, Arabs bombing a market, and French, or we can maybe assume are eco-terrorists, bombing the Parisian underground. In this sense, the game seems to bear out Bush's promise that the war on terror will not end until every terrorist of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. But this is precisely the ideological fantasy that stitches together the war on terror worldview, the constitutive fantasy that provides its fundamental coherence. Slavoj Žižek explains that an ideological fantasy is the constitutive excess that allows a society to pull its disparate parts together into one seeming whole. He says, what appears as the hindrance to society's full identity with itself is actually its positive condition. By transposing onto the Jew, or in this case the terrorist, the role of the foreign body which introduces in the social organism disintegration and antagonism, the fantasy image of society qua consistent harmonious whole is rendered possible. In other words, only through the constitutive excess of the terrorist does it become possible for post-September 11th US or Western society to imagine itself as a unified whole. In the context of the war on terror and Counter-Strike, terrorists are imagined as non-differentiated bad guys, fought by non-differentiated good guys, reducing the war on terror to a simple and non-ideological conflict. But the real of this desire, that is the limit into which this ideological fantasy crashes, is precisely that terrorism is not non-differentiated, but that the war on terror is run through with racist, Islamophobic, and xenophobic undertones. So we can take, for instance, the difference between how US politicians and media, especially those who are right-wing bent, discuss different types of terrorists. Islamic fundamentalism as a well-organized and funded menace looms large in the political imaginary of terror, while right-wing militias in the US are regarded as patriots defending their Second Amendment rights, or individual white terrorists like the Unabomber or Dylan Roof are regarded as mentally ill loners, and the radical ideologies are downplayed or dismissed. What this tells us about Counter-Strike is that it endorses the Bush-era fantasy of a divided world characterized by a battle between good and evil with no middle ground, no ideological motives, and no rationalizations. In this sense, the war on terror mentality represents a continuation of a larger American worldview shaped by the Cold War. The war on terror did not change US culture, but merely intensified trends already fundamental to the US self-image. Jacques Rancière argues that, despite media claims to the contrary, the September 11th attacks were not a rupture in US culture, but instead confirmed existing ideology. Rancière explains that a symbolic event is the name for any event that strikes a blow to the existing regime of relations between the symbolic and the real. It is an event that the existing modes of symbolization are incapable of apprehending, and which therefore reveals a fissure in the relation of the real to the symbolic. This means that a rupture has only occurred when the event transcends the linguistic, narrative, and ideological structures that give meaning to daily life. when what has occurred cannot be understood or explained through any available worldview. However, Rancière claims that September 11th was not such a rupture because, on the evening of the same day, the president already had the words on hand to capture what had happened. Forces of evil had attacked the forces of good. Through our performance in Beckett Spam's Counter-Strike, we sought to disrupt this simplistic dichotomy by using guerrilla performance to make the game space strange, to disrupt the seeming normalcy of the game, thereby revealing the already absurdly constructed space of a non-ideological war on terror. Performance, or re-performance, as this is perhaps more appropriately, is a space for generating both knowledge and error, particularly when re-performance takes the form of military reenactment. In Performing Remains, Rebecca Schneider argues that reenactment, through its postmodern disruption of linear history, works to both encode the past on bodies and highlight the error of the past, which is always already performed. The Schneider claims the resiliently eruptive rub and call of live bodies, like biological machines of affective transmission, insist that physical acts are a means of knowing. Bodies are sites for transmission, even if simultaneously they are also manipulants of error and forgetting. In the case of Beckett Spam's Counter-Strike, our verbal performance of the lines of Endgame and our physical performance of playing the video game, combined with the digital performance of our characters who acted and spoke in digital space, interacting with other players, almost always by getting killed, because we were not good at the game. But we were good at performing. We performed both physically in 123 Pleasant Street and digitally in the game environment. In these performances, we confronted both the remembering of terrorism and the error or forgetting inherent in the game's ideological fantasy. Given our ideologically disruptive goal, Beckett was a fitting choice of playwright to import into the space of Counter-Strike, because Beckett is a dramatist of dead ideology and anti-ideological spaces. But he's also a dramatist of the absurd, which gave us as performers the opportunity to highlight the absurdity of the game's phantasmatic, non-ideological space. Plays like Waiting for Godot, Happy Days, and Endgame are set in essentially non-spaces, places outside the normal realm of human activity, whether in barren wastelands or a house which seems to hold the last living humans, however worn down and deformed, after some kind of apocalyptic cataclysm. That's the setting of Endgame, for those of you who haven't read it recently. But in these non-spaces, devoid of the socio-cultural structures that made ideology necessary, characters continue to cling futilely to remnants of memory and culture, a shredded symbolic order amidst the eruption of the real. There is a sullen inevitability about the characters in Beckett's drama, a sense of the continual and never-ending drudgery of existence. As academics, we can relate. When Clov asks, "Why this farce day after day?" Ham responds, "Routine. One never knows." This is the way with Beckett's drama. The characters are caught in the routine of their daily lives in which they can change nothing, and even when things do change, they become worse. Even death doesn't offer an escape for the characters in Endgame, because death is simultaneously impossible and inevitable, the paradox of the non-life these characters lead. In roughly the middle of the play, Ham asks if Clov would come and say goodbye before leaving, leading into this dialogue about death and the universe. Clov, "Oh, I shouldn't think so." Ham, "But you might be merely dead in your kitchen." Clov, "The result would be the same." Ham, "Yes, but how would I know if you were merely dead in your kitchen?" Clov, "Well, sooner or later I'd start to stink." Ham, "You stink already. The whole place stinks of corpses." Clov, "The whole universe." Ham, "To hell with the universe." This tedious sameness is matched by the repetitions of meaningless life and death in Counter-Strike, a game in which dead players come back to life at the beginning of each round, resuming their now ghostly duties as either terrorists or counter-terrorists. Without meaning to trivialize gameplay, each round has the same combatants, the same objectives, and the same limited number of tactical approaches to those objectives. However, by importing the already alienated dramaturgy of Beckett's Endgame into Counter-Strike, our performance attempted to disrupt the usual horizon of expectations for gameplay. This is the goal of guerrilla theater, or guerrilla art in general, to make the spaces of everyday life strange by imposing art where it is not expected, thereby drawing attention to the constructed nature of norms. Whether or not our performance made other players question the reality of Counter-Strike, it sought to draw attention to the ideological functioning of the game among those who saw our performance, and certainly affected our perception of the game as performance space, cultural text, and ideological warfare.